The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when something huge is about to happen. The news hit like a bombshell, catching everyone off guard. Charlie Kirk, a political titan, was dead. But the way it was announced made no sense. It wasn't just the shock of the death, it was the mysterious circumstances surrounding it. A loud gasp echoed through the crowded press room as the camera zoomed in on Senator John Kennedy standing at the podium. His normally confident demeanor was replaced by a grave seriousness that sent chills through the room. His voice, steady but low, sent a ripple through the audience. "I didn't expect to be standing here today, but I owe it to the American people and to Charlie to tell you the truth." The room fell into stunned silence as Kennedy's words hung in the air. The walls, once filled with reporters' chatter, were now completely still, waiting for him to drop the bomb. "It wasn't an accident," he said, looking directly into the camera, his gaze unwavering. "Charlie Kirk was murdered, and I know who's behind it." Gasps erupted, followed by a frantic buzz. The reporters scrambled for their phones, furiously typing. Whispers filled the room, the shock palpable, but Kennedy was unshaken. His voice didn't waver as he continued. For months, Charlie had been investigating something powerful, something bigger than both of us, and just when he was about to blow the lid off it, he's gone. But here's the part you're not going to believe. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was strategic, a message sent to anyone who dares to get too close to the truth. His words lingered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The audience was no longer asking questions. They were listening, waiting, their eyes fixed on the man who had just dropped the most shocking revelation of the year. What happened next? Everyone wanted to know. But for now, Kennedy wasn't ready to say more. He gave a brief nod to the camera before he turned to leave, the silence in the room now filled with murmurs of disbelief. The truth was out there, but what Kennedy knew could change everything. And the real question was, would the public ever be ready to hear it? Senator John Kennedy stood behind the press room podium, his hands gripping the edges, his mind racing back to the moments before the storm had broken. He couldn't shake the image of Charlie, his old friend, a political partner in crime, a man who had shared too many secrets yet kept even more. The weight of those secrets now felt like an anchor around his neck, dragging him deeper into a fight he hadn't seen coming. In the days after Charlie's death, Kennedy had searched through files, texts, and private conversations, piecing together a story no one was ready to hear. The truth was buried deep, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in layers of deception and manipulation. But as Kennedy sat in his office late one night, the faint hum of the city outside his window, the pieces began to align. Charlie Kirk had always been more than just a politician. His rise to fame had come on the backs of scandalous exposés, behind-the-scenes political deals, and a razor-sharp mind that knew how to manipulate the system. But somewhere along the way, he had changed. He had started digging into something bigger, something dangerous. Kennedy's mind went back to the conversation they had in the back of a smoky bar in Washington, D.C., the night before Charlie had gone public with his latest investigation. "I've got something," Charlie had said, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. He had leaned forward, the whiskey in his hand trembling slightly as if he were on the verge of something huge, something that could bring it all crashing down. "I can't say too much, John, but this one could bring down the whole system. You need to be ready." Kennedy had laughed it off. "Charlie, you're always chasing ghosts. You get these ideas in your head and the next thing you know, you're in way too deep. Be careful." But Charlie hadn't been careful. He'd started asking the kinds of questions that politicians rarely asked, digging into things that had been buried by the powerful for decades, and that had made him dangerous. Dangerous to people with everything to lose, people with the ability to silence anyone who threatened them. A few weeks later, Charlie had disappeared for 2 days. When he finally reappeared, there was something different about him. His usual confident swagger had been replaced by a subtle fear that crept into his eyes whenever anyone mentioned the investigation. He didn't speak much, but Kennedy knew. He knew that Charlie had uncovered something so damaging, so devastating that it was only a matter of time before someone took action. The worst part was that Kennedy had been warned. Months ago, a source close to Charlie had pulled him aside in a shadowy corner of a parking garage. The voice was low, almost a whisper, and the warning had been clear. "Keep him out of it, John. You don't know who's watching." But Kennedy had been too busy. too distracted by his own rise, his own ambitions to pay attention. And now the price for that negligence had come due. The days following Charlie's death were filled with questions no one could answer. His family had been devastated, but the most unsettling part was the lack of clarity. No one seemed to know the full story of how Charlie had ended up dead, and more importantly, why. There were no leads, no suspects. Just a growing suspicion that something sinister was at play. Kennedy knew that Charlie's death wasn't just a random act of violence. No, this had been carefully orchestrated, meticulously planned. Someone had wanted to send a message, and Charlie had been the target. As Kennedy sifted through the evidence, he found something buried in the files. A secret document, encrypted and hidden deep in Charlie's files. It was a list of names. Powerful names. People who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes. People who had the means to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. The document was incomplete, but it was enough. Enough to piece together the conspiracy that had cost Charlie his life. Kennedy felt his pulse quicken as he read the names, each one more influential than the last. And then it hit him. This was bigger than Charlie. Bigger than even the political machine Kennedy had been a part of for so long. There were forces at play here, forces that were above the law, above the government, above everything. Kennedy clenched his fists. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on his ability to stand against the tide. But now, standing on the edge of a political conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of power, he wasn't sure who he could trust. He had to make a choice. Expose the truth and risk his career, his safety, or bury it and let Charlie's death go unsolved. His memory lost in the silence of political corruption. The weight of the decision pressed on him as he looked at the file in his hands. This was no longer just about Charlie. This was about justice, about exposing a system that had failed everyone. And for the first time in his life, Senator John Kennedy didn't know if he was ready for the fight that lay ahead. But there was no turning back now. Senator John Kennedy sat in his office, the room filled with the soft hum of his old fan, the one that had been with him since his early days in politics. It was his only comfort in the chaotic storm of his thoughts. His hands trembled slightly as he held the file, the same one he had been studying for hours. He had been mulling over it, trying to make sense of what he had uncovered. But the more he dug, the more it became clear. Charlie's death was no accident. A sharp knock on the door broke his concentration. Kennedy snapped the file shut and looked up to see Senator McAllister, a longtime colleague, standing in the doorway. McAllister's face was grim, his usual polished demeanor gone. "John, we need to talk." Kennedy stood, motioning for McAllister to come in. As McAllister took a seat, Kennedy knew the conversation was going to be about Charlie and the truth he had uncovered. "You've seen the file, I assume," Kennedy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you think?" McAllister shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping the armrest. "I think you're getting in deeper than you realize, John. You're not just up against some political game anymore. You're facing a system that doesn't like being challenged." Kennedy's heart sank. He knew exactly what McAllister was talking about. This wasn't just about politics. It was about control. About power so deep that it had infiltrated every facet of the system. People who were untouchable, who could make someone disappear without anyone ever knowing the truth. Charlie Kirk had been one of the few willing to dig into it. And that's why he was dead. "Who do you think did this?" Kennedy asked, his voice low, as if saying the words aloud would make the conspiracy feel even more real. McAllister hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for someone to overhear. "I don't know, but it's clear that someone powerful wants this to stay buried. They'll stop at nothing to keep their names off that list." The weight of McAllister's words hit Kennedy like a ton of bricks. He had known that Charlie had uncovered something big, but he hadn't fully grasped the danger until now. The list of names that Charlie had kept hidden was explosive, and now Kennedy was in possession of it. "I have to expose this, McAllister," Kennedy said, his voice filled with conviction. "This isn't just about politics anymore. People need to know what happened to Charlie." McAllister's face twisted into a grimace. "You think you can just expose these people and walk away unscathed? Think again. This is a game of survival, not justice. You don't know the lengths they'll go to." Kennedy clenched his jaw. He had heard the warnings before, He had faced threats, backroom deals, and political pressure throughout his career, but none of it had felt as real, as deadly as what he was dealing with now. He could feel the pressure mounting, the choices narrowing. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Sarah, stepped in, holding a stack of papers in her hands. She looked at Kennedy with a hesitant glance as though unsure whether to interrupt, but when she saw McAllister, she seemed to realize it was time to speak. "Senator, there's someone here to see you," Sarah said, her voice soft. "He says it's urgent." Kennedy's eyes narrowed. He didn't have time for interruptions, but the look on Sarah's face made him pause. There was something about this that felt different. "Who is it?" Kennedy asked, his voice sharp. "A man named Elliot Graves," she said. "He insists you meet him, says it's about Charlie." The name hit Kennedy like a shockwave. Elliot Graves was a journalist, a name that had been circulating in the rumors surrounding Charlie's death. Graves had been one of the few reporters who had taken Charlie's investigation seriously. Kennedy had seen his name on the list Charlie had kept secret, but he hadn't made the connection until now. "I'll see him," Kennedy said, motioning for Sarah to send Graves in. He turned back to McAllister. "This may be the break we need." McAllister stood and adjusted his suit. "Just be careful, John. I don't know who you're dealing with here, but you don't want to make them your enemy." The door creaked open, and Elliot Graves stepped in, his face drawn and tired. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, but there was an unmistakable fire in his gaze. He looked like someone who had been running for far too long. "Senator Kennedy," Graves said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk." Kennedy gestured for him to sit. "You have information on Charlie?" Graves nodded, pulling out a manila folder from under his arm. "I've been following the trail Charlie left behind. It's bigger than we thought. I have evidence, undeniable proof, that points to something even darker than what you've uncovered. This wasn't just about Charlie digging into corrupt politics. This is about a shadow network pulling the strings from the highest levels, and it goes all the way to the top." Kennedy's heart skipped a beat. The stakes had just gone from dangerous to life-threatening. He opened the folder, feeling his pulse quicken as he looked at the documents inside. Pictures, notes, names, a map. It was all there. The final piece of the puzzle Charlie had been trying to solve. Graves leaned in closer. "Senator, you have to be ready for what's coming. Once this is exposed, nothing will ever be the same." Kennedy's eyes locked with Graves's. The truth was finally within reach, but at what cost? His mind raced as he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. The Shadow Network wasn't just a conspiracy, it was a war, and now he was a part of it. "I'm ready," Kennedy said, his voice steady but his mind racing. "Let's bring them to light." Senator Kennedy sat back in his chair, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He couldn't escape the truth. It was no longer just a theory or a suspicion. It was a fact, one that now had undeniable proof in his hands. The pieces of Charlie Kirk's death were falling into place, each one a sharp revelation that carved deeper into Kennedy's soul. The manila folder sat on the desk in front of him, the contents inside too explosive to ignore any longer. Elliot Graves had brought more than just whispers. He had brought evidence, names, dates, photographs, the kind of proof that could topple governments if it fell into the wrong hands. And yet Kennedy knew that it had to be exposed. The quiet hum of the office was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Kennedy stood up, the familiar tension returning. Sarah, his assistant, poked her head in. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Something was wrong. "Senator, you need to see this," she said, stepping inside with a flurry of urgency. Kennedy's heart skipped. He already knew what was coming. It was too much. Too much had already been revealed. He had no choice but to follow through now, even if it meant the ultimate sacrifice. "What is it, Sarah?" Kennedy asked, trying to steady his voice. "There's a news broadcast coming up, Senator. It's live coverage. It's about Charlie Kirk's death. Someone's making an announcement about the investigation." Kennedy's mind raced. He had been preparing his own reveal, gathering the evidence and building his case carefully. But someone else had jumped in front of him. Someone was now pushing the story into the public eye, and they were doing it without his permission. That wasn't the only problem. The news stations, the press, and even his own colleagues were beginning to look at the situation from an entirely new angle. The network of corruption Charlie had stumbled upon was bigger than he could have ever imagined. "Who's behind this broadcast?" Kennedy asked, his voice filled with controlled urgency. It's not clear yet, but they're broadcasting live. People are talking about it already. Someone's exposing information they shouldn't. Kennedy cursed under his breath. He couldn't let someone else control the narrative. He couldn't let Charlie's investigation slip into the hands of untrustworthy individuals. Not after all the work he had done to uncover the truth. This was his fight. With one swift motion, Kennedy grabbed the file from his desk and walked out of the office, Sarah trailing behind him. He had to get ahead of this. He had to control the narrative. The walk to the conference room felt like the longest of his life. Every step seemed to take him closer to an uncertain future. The door to the conference room opened with a heavy creak, and Kennedy strode in, his face set in a determined frown. As he entered, he saw the others gathered around, senators, political aides, and reporters. They were all glued to the television screen. The broadcast was already live. He could hear the words faintly from across the room. "Senator Kennedy, we have a serious problem. You need to see this," one of the aides said, gesturing toward the screen. Kennedy's eyes locked onto the TV. On the screen, a man in a dark suit was speaking directly into the camera. The words he spoke hit Kennedy like a freight train. "I've been investigating Charlie Kirk's death for months, and I'm here to reveal the truth. What the public doesn't know is that Charlie was murdered by a powerful political faction. A faction that controls much of the country's decision-making. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is real. We have the evidence. The truth must be heard." Kennedy's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected this. The man on screen was Graves. Elliot Graves was going rogue, exposing information Kennedy wasn't ready to release. His face burned with frustration. He had planned to bring it all to light, but Graves had gone ahead and thrown it into the open. The camera zoomed in on Graves as he pulled out the manila folder, the one Kennedy had seen earlier. Graves opened it up, showing the evidence, photographs, documents, and names. The images were striking. Government officials shaking hands with known criminals, meetings held in secret, deals that were never meant to see the light of day. Kennedy's mind raced. This was supposed to be his revelation. Graves had just turned it into a media circus. But even as Kennedy fumed, a sense of clarity washed over him. The people needed to know the truth, no matter who revealed it first. The problem was Graves wasn't telling the full story. He was only scratching the surface. The true scope of the conspiracy was still hidden, and now it was up to Kennedy to finish what Charlie had started. He couldn't afford to wait. He couldn't afford to be passive anymore. The image on the screen shifted, showing more names, more faces, and more shocking revelations. But Kennedy wasn't just watching anymore. His eyes narrowed as he grabbed the microphone from one of the aides. He stepped in front of the camera and spoke into the mic, his voice cutting through the broadcast with unshakable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just seen is only part of the story. What Elliot Graves failed to tell you is that this network of corruption is not just limited to a few corrupt officials. This goes deeper. Much deeper. I know this because I've been looking into it for months. Charlie Kirk was murdered because he was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would shake this country to its very core. And now I will take the next step to make sure the truth is fully revealed." The room was still. The reporters and politicians were stunned by Kennedy's words. The air felt thick with anticipation, with the unspoken realization that Kennedy wasn't backing down. "I will expose everything," Kennedy continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "I will not rest until the people behind this murder are brought to justice. Charlie Kirk died for one reason only, because he dared to challenge a system that thrives on power, deception, and fear." As Kennedy finished speaking, the room broke into a flurry of questions and shouts. The stage was set, and now the world was watching. The truth had been partially revealed, but the real fight was just beginning. Kennedy knew that this was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving it, and he was ready for the fight ahead. Senator John Kennedy stood alone in his office, the weight of everything finally sinking in. The revelations were out, the battle lines were drawn, and now, the fight to uncover the full truth about Charlie Kirk's death had become his own personal war. He had spent his entire career navigating the political landscape, using his sharp mind and strategic thinking to climb to the top. But nothing had prepared him for this. The public exposure was only the beginning. He had seen how the media had spun the story, how the powers that be had tried to contain the narrative, and now they were coming for him. But what worried Kennedy more than anything wasn't the political fallout. It was what he had seen in those files, the deep network of corruption that spanned farther than he could have ever imagined. People were pulling strings from the shadows, playing a game of power and control, and Charlie Kirk had been the one to uncover it. His phone buzzed on the desk, the silence of the office broken by the message that had just come in. Elliot Graves, the journalist who had gone rogue, the one who had decided to take matters into his own hands. Kennedy hadn't heard from him since the broadcast, and he knew that the information Graves had exposed was only the tip of the iceberg. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. He pressed the green button, his voice steady as he answered. Graves. Senator. Graves's voice crackled through the phone. I've got more. There's a meeting tonight, the kind you need to be at. They're gathering. The people behind Charlie's death. They're not just sitting back anymore, John. They're moving fast. Kennedy's pulse quickened. He had known this moment was coming, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. He had to act, and he had to act fast. But he wasn't the man he had been just a few days ago. He wasn't just the senator anymore. He wasn't just the politician that played the system to get ahead. He was now fighting for something deeper, something far more personal. This was about justice, about honoring Charlie's memory, and about exposing the truth no matter the cost. I'm in, Kennedy said firmly without hesitation. Where and when? That night, Kennedy stood outside a warehouse in an abandoned industrial district, the cold air biting at his skin. The place was eerily quiet, and the lights from the nearby street lamps cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. This was the kind of place where deals were made in the dark, where secrets were buried, and where the powerful people that had silenced Charlie would now meet. Kennedy's heart raced as he approached the entrance, his hand instinctively brushing the inside pocket of his coat, where he kept the evidence Charlie had passed along to him. The file was heavy with the weight of the truth, and he had no illusions that this fight was going to be anything but dangerous. Senator, a voice said from behind him, low and cold. Kennedy turned to see Graves, his face pale but determined, stepping out from the shadows. Graves was nervous, that much was clear, but his resolve was unshakable. This wasn't just about a story anymore. It was personal for him too. This is it, Graves said, glancing around as though expecting someone to jump out of the darkness. These people think they control everything, but they're wrong. They never thought you'd go this far. I'm not backing down, Kennedy replied, his voice unwavering. I came this far because I know the truth, Graves. And I'm not going to let them bury it. Graves nodded, his expression serious. They're here. They'll try to intimidate you, to silence you, but you have to keep pushing. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what Charlie tried to do. Inside the warehouse, the room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as the men and women who controlled the network of power gathered around a table. Kennedy recognized some of their faces from his years in politics. Men who had climbed the ladder by stepping on others, pulling strings, manipulating situations to their favor. The kind of people who thrived on fear, secrecy, and control. The leader of the group, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, looked up as Kennedy entered the room. His smile was cold, a gesture more of contempt than anything friendly. Well, if it isn't Senator Kennedy, the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You've made quite a name for yourself these past few days. But this, coming here, this isn't the way to solve things. Kennedy met the man's gaze with calm resolve. I'm not here to solve things. I'm here to expose you for what you are. You killed Charlie. You thought you could silence him, but I'm not going to let you get away with it. Not anymore. The room went silent. Kennedy could feel the weight of their gaze, the tension in the air thickening. Every word he spoke felt like it was drawing a line in the sand. They wanted him to back down. They wanted him to fear them. But the old Kennedy, the one who played politics with the same ease he breathed, was gone. Now he was standing tall, fighting for something bigger than himself. You have no idea what you're up against, Senator, the man said, his smile fading. We've controlled this country's secrets for decades. You think you can just walk in here and expose us? Kennedy didn't flinch. I know what you've done, and I know what you're capable of. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. Graves stepped forward, standing beside Kennedy. This is bigger than just one person, he said. This is about the people you've destroyed, about the lives you've ruined to keep your power, and it ends now. The group around the table exchanged wary glances, but the leader's demeanor shifted. He stood, his cold eyes narrowing. "Then let's see what you can do, Kennedy. If you think you can take us down, prove it." The cold metal door of the warehouse slammed shut behind them, leaving the echo of their footsteps in the thick silence. Senator John Kennedy's chest was tight as he stood there in the center of the dimly lit room, facing the shadowy figures of the people who had orchestrated Charlie Kirk's death. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the resolve that had settled into his bones. The past few days had been a whirlwind, but now, with everything on the line, Kennedy felt a quiet certainty that he hadn't felt before. As the group of powerful figures looked on, a sense of foreboding thickened the air. The leader of the group, a man named Victor Lang, stepped forward, his smile still thin and mocking. "So, Senator," Lang said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you think you can just barge in here and expose everything? You've been playing with fire, Kennedy, and now you're going to get burned?" Kennedy's jaw tightened. The weight of the evidence, the file Charlie had left behind, was heavy in his hands, and the truth had been building inside him, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. But as Lang's words sank in, Kennedy felt something shift. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was about survival. It was about standing up to a system that had silenced too many voices and crushed too many lives. "I've already been burned, Lang," Kennedy replied, his voice steady but filled with a cold fury. "I've seen how your game is played. You kill the truth and you expect no one to care. But that's where you're wrong. The truth always comes out." Lang's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something darker, more dangerous. The tension in the room thickened as the figures around the table began to murmur. But Kennedy stood tall, unwavering. He knew what this was. It was the final test, the one where everything he had fought for, the truth, his legacy, even his life, was on the line. "You think you're the first politician to try and expose us?" Lang sneered, walking closer to Kennedy, his eyes narrowing. "You're just a cog in a machine that's been running for decades. You can't take us down. We control everything: money, media, power. And you, Senator, are just a footnote in a history you'll never rewrite." The words hit like a slap, but Kennedy didn't flinch. He had seen the machine at work for years. He had played the game, and he had come to understand its rules better than anyone. He knew how to bend the system to his will, but this was different. This wasn't about gaining political leverage. This was about breaking free from a system built on fear, lies, and manipulation. Kennedy looked around the room, his eyes taking in the figures who thought they were untouchable. But he wasn't afraid of them anymore. He had seen the people behind the curtain, and he knew that their power was built on nothing but secrets. "I'm not afraid of you," Kennedy said, his voice rising with authority. "You can control the system, but you can't control the truth. And the truth is, you've been exploiting this country for far too long. You can't bury it anymore. It's time for it to come out. All of it." As Kennedy spoke, a murmur ran through the room. The other figures shifted, uneasy, but Lang only smirked, his arrogance still intact. "You don't get it, do you, Kennedy?" Lang's voice was low and dangerous. "You're in too deep now. You've exposed enough for people to listen. But you don't know who you're dealing with. You've crossed a line you can't come back from." At that moment, Kennedy's mind flashed back to the early days, his rise in politics, the deals he had made, the compromises he had accepted in exchange for power. He had always known the system was corrupt, but he had chosen to fight from within it. Now he was fighting from the outside, against forces far greater than anything he had ever faced. But something had changed. Something inside him had clicked. "I crossed that line the moment I chose to expose the truth," Kennedy said, his voice steady, resolute. "And now I'm going to finish what Charlie started. If you think you can silence me, you're wrong. Because I'm not backing down. Not anymore." Lang's face twisted in anger, his hands balling into fists. "You don't know who you're up against," he growled, stepping forward. "You think you can bring us down with a few revelations? You'll regret this, Kennedy." But just as Lang took a step toward him, the room went dark. The sudden blackout left everyone in complete darkness, and for a moment, it felt as if the world itself had stopped. The murmur of confusion spread through the room as Kennedy's instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just here to fight for his survival. He was here to bring the system to its knees. The lights flickered back on and the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Kennedy turned to see Graves standing tall, holding up a small device in his hand. "They've been watching you, Lang," Graves said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. "But we've been watching you too." A loud click echoed as Graves pressed the button. The file containing everything, every name, every piece of evidence flashed on the nearby monitors, filling the room with images of corruption and betrayal. The room erupted in chaos as the truth finally hit them all like a tidal wave. The dark network of power, the conspiracies, the hidden agendas, they were out in the open now. Lang stepped back, his eyes wide with shock. The arrogance had disappeared, replaced by panic. "No," he whispered, as if trying to stop the inevitable. "You can't do this." Kennedy took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "The truth doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the people." The warehouse was still buzzing with the noise of the revelation. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the room was filled with the hum of panic and disbelief. Kennedy stood at the center, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. He had exposed the truth, the corruption, the lies. He had done what no one else had the courage to do, and now, the consequences were unfolding. As the lights flickered back to life and the files of evidence flashed across the monitors, Kennedy felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had been prepared for resistance, but the powerful figures in the room were scrambling now, looking for an escape, trying to salvage what little they could from the wreckage Kennedy had unleashed. Lang, the leader of the shadowy group, was pacing back and forth, his face contorted with anger. "You think this will end with you, Kennedy? You think people will believe you?" His voice was rising, desperate. "They'll bury your name with mine. It's over." Kennedy didn't flinch. He had been in these moments before, moments where fear could cripple someone's resolve. But he had made his choice long ago. The moment he had decided to speak out to expose the truth about Charlie's death, he knew there would be no going back. "You're wrong," Kennedy said, his voice calm and steady. "The truth doesn't just disappear because you want it to. People will see it. They'll hear it. They'll demand accountability, and you can't hide from that." Lang's eyes narrowed. "You've exposed us, Kennedy, but do you really think you're safe? You're not even the first to try. The system will crush you just like it did to Charlie." Kennedy took a deep breath. The words stung, but they didn't break him. He had spent years navigating the dark corridors of politics and corruption, and now he was on the other side. He could feel the pressure, the weight of everything he had uncovered, but it was no longer about him. It was about the people, about the truth that had been buried for so long. That was what mattered now. "I'm not backing down," Kennedy said firmly, "and neither are the people who want to see change. You can threaten me, you can try to silence me, but you've lost. The truth is out. The world sees it now." As Lang opened his mouth to respond, a voice cut through the tension. It was Graves, who had remained silent until now, watching from the shadows as everything unfolded. "Senator's right," Graves said, stepping forward. "The truth is out, and it's too late to stop it. You've already lost. This isn't just about a few secrets anymore. This is about a system that's been broken for years, and it's finally going to change." Kennedy turned to Graves, his eyes meeting the journalists with silent understanding. They had both walked into the storm, knowing the dangers but committed to the cause. They had both seen the corruption firsthand, and now they had the chance to rebuild, to restore what had been stolen from the people. The sound of sirens echoed outside the warehouse, a reminder that the law was closing in. It was a moment of clarity for Kennedy. He had exposed the network of corruption, but this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. As the authorities arrived, Kennedy's thoughts turned to Charlie. He had died for this, for the truth. And in that moment, Kennedy realized that Charlie's death wasn't in vain. The fight they had started, the fight to expose the truth, had just ignited a spark that would burn through the lies and deceit. The authorities moved in, and Lang and the other figures in the room were quickly taken into custody. But Kennedy knew this was just the first step. Accountability had been restored, but the work was far from over. The damage these people had done went beyond a single investigation. It was a systemic rot that had to be torn down piece by piece. "Thank you, Senator," Graves said, his voice full of respect. "You did it. You brought them down." Kennedy nodded but didn't respond immediately. He was lost in thought, his mind already racing ahead. This was just one battle. There were still more to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. "We did it, Graves," Kennedy said quietly. "But the work isn't over. We've only scratched the surface." There's a long road ahead and I'm not done yet. As Kennedy walked out of the warehouse, the cold night air hit him, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. The darkness had been pierced, and as the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Kennedy knew that this was a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. This was the beginning of a new fight, and for the first time in years, Kennedy felt ready for it.